Hello, I'm Dr. Matt Coots, and I am an adjunct professor here at Griffith University and a professor at Bowling Green State University in the United States. And I'm really happy to be with you today as we talk about the role of complexity and particularly how it relates to innovation. So one of the things that's important for you to note from the outset is we're going to spend most of this talk, next 15-20 minutes or so, talking about complexity. And I want you to think, put on the lens as you're reading, as you're watching, as you're thinking about this conversation, think about how complexity plays in with innovation. So I want to introduce first some key thoughts. As one, Alvin Toffler from the 1970s made this statement that really sets the tone for where we are at in the 21st century in Western healthcare. And this is regardless if you're in the UK, the United States, Australia, or any other westernized or advanced healthcare. It's important that we understand how critical this concept that he outlines about learning and is related to innovation and complexity. Alvin said nearly 4 decades ago, over 5 decades ago in fact, that the illiterate of the 21st century, which is the century we're in now, will not be those who can't read or write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. And that's really important to understand. Now, this is a paraphrase of what Toffler said, but it's important to note that as we talk about innovation and as we think about complexity and the related constructs of change, creativity, etc., chaos, falls within that. It's important to understand how critical it is that our experience typically biases us the most from being innovative and handling complexity. Because in reality, the best way to navigate a complex environment is innovative behaviors. In a previous discussion, I talked about Peter Drucker's 7 drivers of innovation. And if you review that and look at the 7 drivers of innovation, if you didn't get a chance to see that, you can Google that. You'll see that there are 7 things that facilitate innovation. Each one of those things requires navigating the unexpected or navigating complexity. And in order to do that, you have to follow Toffler's wisdom here, where he says, if we will fail, if we refuse to unlearn and relearn, that what we previously have learned will end up being a detriment to us. And there's no truer statement, or that is no more true than when we talk about innovation. Because we will not be able to innovate if we only rely on our learned experiences and aren't willing to embrace unlearning what we've learned and relearning what's going on today. Within healthcare, the British Medical Journal put out this statement, and you can see the reference there, 2018. So this is relatively recent as per this recording, but he talks about healthcare leaders specifically, and this is Rook's research at the BMJ. Healthcare leaders are particularly challenged by complex and ambiguous contexts. Okay, that's the unlearning, that's the unexpected that we talk about in Drucker's drivers of innovation. Research, and here's what's interesting as a researcher myself, research in both qualitative and qualitative genres point to the need for leaders to develop their meaning-making capacities. What is that? We're going to unpack that in a moment. To deal with the increased level of complexity and ambiguity. In healthcare, ambiguity and complexity are at an all-time high. In fact, I have other sources that are not cited here, but my other research that I've read makes some pretty conclusive statements that there is no more complex industry on the planet than healthcare. And that is, of course, that's arguable, but there is a lot of good, sound data and research and evidence to support the fact that healthcare may in fact be the most complex industry on the globe. So because of that, the meaning-making capacity of healthcare managers is really, really important. If we don't know how to make meaning out of our environments, we cannot be successful. Roark goes on to say in this particular article that fewer than 5% of healthcare's within the healthcare leadership are able to do that, are able to develop meaning-making capacities, which means if you are able to make meaning out of your environment, which again goes back to Toffler's willingness to unlearn and relearn. And if you are unlearning and relearning, you are in fact living a lifestyle of innovation and practicing a management process or a leadership process that fosters a high level or high degree or amount of innovation. Fewer than 5% of leaders within healthcare actually do that. So I want you to ask yourself right here and now, will you be or are you one of these leaders, one of these 5%ers? That's a pretty small percentage. Are you one of these 5% of leaders who can develop a meaning-making capacity, which again goes back to unlearning and relearning, because you have to be able to diagnose your environment at the speed in which it is changing, not in hindsight, not after the fact. So in order to diagnose your environment in real time, you have to develop a certain skill set. And we'll talk about what that is. It's contextual intelligence. And when you do that, you will find innovation comes much more easy for you as the manager, but also you create a culture where the people around you also find it easier to innovate, easier to generate new ideas, easier to experiment with different ways of doing things. And anytime we can experiment with different ways of doing things, innovation usually comes to that. Now, there's also a consequence or a side effect of that type of experimentation, and that is we discover a lot of ways not to do things efficiently and not to do things well. We can't look at those as failures. We have to look at those as learning lessons on what to do differently next time. And when we approach it from failure being beneficial, or what I like to say as chaos is the package your potential arrives in, when we view chaos or failures as an opportunity to learn how to do something differently, we find innovation usually flourishes, which ultimately leads to better outcomes down the road. So that model I was referring to that helps create our meaning-making capacity and really drives the capacity to unlearn and relearn is something, my own research that is very near and dear to my heart, that I've come to call contextual intelligence. And I've written several manuscripts on this. You can just Google my last name, Kutz, K-U-T-Z, and contextual intelligence, and there's about 6 or 7 manuscripts out there in academic journals that you can find that will talk about what the model is. But I want to unpack it for you very briefly right here, and this is the big picture construct. Contextual intelligence thinking requires embracing complexity, and that's what we're going to talk about here in more detail in a minute primarily. It also requires understanding tacit awareness, which we are not going to spend a lot of time on, and also synchronicity, which we will not spend a whole lot of time on. But these 3 are prerequisite ways of thinking. So real briefly, complexity is when we are willing to embrace integration. Complexity and understanding what complexity is really is easier to understand when we contrast it to complication or what's complicated. And it is important that you understand that something that is complex is not necessarily complicated, and something that is complex is certainly not, or I'm sorry, something that is complicated is certainly not complex. And those are more than just semantics. And I'll come to that in the next few slides. We'll talk about that in detail. The second thing, though, is understanding tacit awareness. So tacit awareness is where your hunches, your feelings, your gut reactions, where they come from. Because it is incorrect to assume that gut feelings, gut reactions, instinctual responses just came from nowhere or didn't come from anywhere. That would be a mistake. The literature and the evidence is very clear that our gut reactions, our instincts, the wisdom that we operate with comes from somewhere. Someone who has tacit awareness is aware of where that knowledge came from. So tacit knowledge is knowledge that you know to be true, but have no idea where it came from. So if I were to ask you, if I were to just think to myself, how do I know that I'm speaking English, for example? I don't know. I don't know how I know that. I just know that I'm speaking English. That's tacit knowledge. How do you know something is right or wrong? How do you know this is the best procedure for this situation? How do you know this is the correct diagnosis for this injury or the best policy to implement for this particular behavior you're trying to initiate? And a lot of times the answer to that, depending on our experience, is I don't know. I just know it's the right thing to do. And that's tacit knowledge. The work of the contextually intelligent person they spend a lot of time and work going back and rehearsing the lessons that they've learned that reiterate these lessons that they implement and the knowledge that they have from a tacit background. This is uniquely different from explicit knowledge. Explicit knowledge is knowledge that you read in a textbook, you read in hear in a lecture, something that can be told one person to another. For example, I can tell you that 2 + 2 = 4, and you can just memorize it. It's a fact. It's the way it is. There's no argument about that. That's explicit knowledge, and you just have to memorize it. And most of what we do in school requires relaying explicit knowledge, one person to another person, a professor to a student, an intern to a student, etc. Most of what we do in life, however, comes from tacit knowledge. So we need to understand that. People who are really good at innovation and navigating complexity understand that I need to spend time learning and rehearsing and trying to remember where those lessons that I live by came from. That's what tacit awareness is, which leads to, you'll see on the screen here and the model here, which leads to great moments of insight, all right? Which is a part of 3D thinking, which will be what we'll talk about later in another lecture. And then synchronicity. Synchronicity is the meaning we make from coincidences. So when a coincidence happens, let's say you have a certain agenda item on your agenda for a staff meeting coming up, and you have an agenda item and you haven't told anybody about the agenda items yet because you're just developing them and you know this is something that is important to talk about. Let's say 3 hours before the scheduled meeting where you want to bring up this agenda item, you happen to be walking through your department or your team, and you hear some other staff members talking about the issue that you want to bring up on the agenda. And you hear them talking about it, and you think to yourself, oh, isn't that strange? I wanted to bring this same thing up in our department meeting later today. Now you have a choice at that moment. You will either, that moment when those two coincidences collide is called synchronicity. They happen to be talking about it, you wanted to bring it up, and you have an option right then and there to make certain meaning or assumptions about that topic. And you're likely to do what most people do if you hear that and reaffirm that, yes, this must be a really important topic to talk about. That would be one way to interpret that scenario. How you interpret that and the collision of those experiences is called synchronicity. Most people make assumptions when they have a coincidence like that happen, and they're not aware that they're making an assumption. The assumption would be, like the example I just gave, this must be a really important conversation. You could also interpret that to mean, however, that, well, maybe I don't need to talk about this. The staff is already aware of it. They're already talking about it. They already have some ideas. So maybe I should take it off the agenda item. So you see how you have two polar opposite interpretations of the coincidences occurring. That phenomenon is called synchronicity. You need to be aware of the fact that you are subject to the phenomenon of synchronicity and how it affects you, because it affects every person differently. One manager may interpret it as, oh, we're not going to talk about it now, it's already been introduced. Another manager may interpret it as, oh, this is really more important than I thought it was because they're actually already talking about it. You see how you can have two different interpretations there. You need to know how you would interpret those coincidences. So that's synchronicity. And you can see from the graphic here that synchronicity, I'm gonna lose my picture, lose my hand, sorry, leads directly to hindsight. And that's really important in how we understand the past. And that's how you discover how you handle synchronicity, by going back to the past and rehearsing how those synchronous events have influenced you in the past. And then complexity, which is what we're going to talk about here for a moment in a little bit more detail. So complexity dynamic is understanding the difference between complicated and complex. And in order to understand complexity, you need to be able to embrace integration and treat complication as a myth. Okay? So what that means is you need to adopt the mental frame of mind that complication is not the way of the world. And in fact, if you say things like life is complicated, the organization is complicated, you are actually not correct. That's a myth. Life is not complicated, it is complex. What that means is I understand that when two things come together, or three or four things, or any number of things come together, once they're integrated together, they can't be separated. All right, that's complexity. A complicated framework says that when two or more things come together, they can be separated. So look at the difference there. In a complex dynamic, when things are integrated together, they cannot be separated. In a complicated dynamic, when two or more things come together, they can be separated. The common example we give for a complex dynamic would be a cake. Let's say you're baking a cake. And in that cake, there's all kinds of ingredients: flour, eggs, milk, sugar, vanilla extract, etc., whatever kind of cake you're making. You put all these ingredients in there, and when you put the ingredients together, they become something new. They become the cake batter. Then you take that batter, put it in an extreme condition, like the oven, high heat, it comes out a cake. And once that cake comes out, let's say you remember, oh, I need eggs for something else. Well, where are the eggs? The eggs are in the cake. You can't go back in and get the eggs out of the cake once it's been integrated and use them for something else. That's complexity. The complicated dynamic would be a car engine. Let's say you've got a car engine and you also have many different parts, several gaskets, spark plugs, carburetors, oil, etc. You put all those into a car and you put it under extreme conditions and you realize it's not working the way you want it to work. So you can go back and say, oh, maybe the spark plugs need to be replaced. So you can take the spark plugs out without affecting the rest of the machine and put new spark plugs in. That's a complicated dynamic. And you can see how problem solving, again, as a manager now, as a healthcare administrator, it's really important that you have the correct perspective here, especially if you're trying to drive innovation and create something new. Because if you try to solve a complex problem, which healthcare is, again, remember we established at the very beginning, there probably is not a more complex industry on the planet than healthcare. So it's safe to assume most of the problems we encounter in healthcare are complexity-based problems. When we try to solve complex problems with complicated techniques, it usually does not work. So let's say we have a human resource problem within healthcare. The complex, which is a complex problem because human resources involve multiple stakeholders, multiple types of policies, etc. They're integrated together. They can't be isolated apart. But what we typically will do is we'll try to solve a complexity problem with a complicated framework by, well, let's just fire this employee. We'll sack them. We'll sack this employee. They no longer are producing what they need to produce, so we'll sack them and bring in someone else. Government tries to solve problems this way too. Government is very, very complex as well. Just bringing in a new prime minister, a new minister, or whatever doesn't solve the problems that we typically have. Just like bringing in new personnel in an organization doesn't typically solve the problem, because it's a complex problem and we're using complicated techniques to solve it. So that's what's really interesting about the complexity dynamic. Now, for the sake of time, I'm going to just show you this slide, and I want you to pause the video here and just look at the slide for a moment and take a few notes here on the difference between, I have two columns here, a Newtonian or mechanical thinking. That's complicated thinking. That is thinking, these are the assumptions that people who live in a complicated framework make. Things like rules are law-abiding and are predictable. Okay? One of the common mistakes managers make when it comes to navigating complexity and initiating innovation is that they assume the rules are the same and stable, and that they assume things are predictable. That's not true in a complex world. So the one column that says Newtonian and mechanical thinking are the types of thinking and the types of assumptions that we make when we are governed by a complicated dynamic. And then the other column, non-Newtonian or quantum thinking, are the assumptions that we make when we are governed by a complex dynamic, which is the way we should be moving towards. So you should be moving your assumptions and your ideas toward the things that are listed in the non-Newtonian quantum thinking column. So again, pause the video for a minute, take a look at these things, and ask yourself, how often and how well do you think in these ways or make these assumptions? That's critical for you creating an environment of innovation and navigating complexity. And then finally, the last thing I want to give to you as far as content is how we can demonstrate contextual intelligence in complex environments. In other words, how can we navigate this? And this is absolutely what I would call, if I could rename it at this point in time, I've written about this in other places, so it's already been named, but I would call it Coutts's cycle of innovation. And basically how this works is when we look at innovation and navigating complex environments, there are 3 stages that you need to go through in order to generate an innovative solution to a problem. One, the first step is recognize that the environment you're in is in fact complex. Recognize that context that you're in is shifting. It's dynamic. It's always moving. It's never the same. Once you recognize that, then you start to look for certain things. You start to look for what's shifted and what's changed. And if you go back to Peter Drucker's 7 drivers, you will see that those are the absolute things that drive innovative thinking and innovation ideas, the unexpected. So when you're looking, so step 1 is recognize things are always shifting and always moving. The second step then is identifying what is shifted and what is moved, knowing the behavior that's deemed important then in that shifted environment. When you recognize something has just shifted or something has just changed, that means there is a new metric of success. There is a new metric for what's deemed as important, and you have to be aware of what that is. If you don't, you will make a tragic mistake of an inappropriate or wrong decision. So once you've recognized it's shifted and that things are shifting, then you need to begin to discover what is now important, what is the success metric in this new environment, and then after you've done that, you've got to initiate a new behavior that provides that new success metric, that new expectation, okay? And that by definition is an innovative behavior. So that's critical. So we navigate complexity by being innovative, and we can be innovative by going through this RKA, I call it, process of recognizing, knowing, and adjusting, which is central to understand. Before you can do that, it's central you understand the difference between complexity and complication, as well as understanding tacit and synchronous behaviors. And then just a concluding thought here is a quote from Plato, which I think sums this up nicely for us all, is if you want to be a pilot or the ship's captain, the person in charge, you must of necessity pay attention to the seasons, the heavens, the stars, the winds, and everything proper to the craft if you want to master the ship. So what Plato is telling us is First of all, this is not new ideas. Plato said it 2,000 years ago. But if you want to truly master the change of your environment and navigate the complex sea of healthcare, you need to pay attention not just to what's right in front of you, you need to pay attention to everything. And as you're paying attention to everything, you see things that you've never seen before. And when you see things that you've never seen before, that by definition is the unexpected, which is one of Peter Drucker's 7 drivers of innovation, which means to navigate that ship, you will by definition become more innovative, which is what we're after. So thank you very much. Here's my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me at any time. I'm happy to talk to you about this more detail later. Thank you.